Hello everyone, and welcome back to Dragalia Foundry, a fan channel where everything Dragalia Lost can be found. In this video, I'm going to give my impressions and thoughts on all of the new units as well as the new Wyrmprints that have just come out as part of the Windswept Harbingers Summon Showcase. Right now we have a Flames of Reflection rerun, both the event and the Summon Showcase. So it's been a pretty slow period in Dragalia Lost. I have to say I haven't really minded very much. Clawful Caper lasted a while, a couple of weeks, but it was actually pretty fun to continue to grind out on that hope and prayer that you might end up getting lucky with the Damascus Ingot. And while that was happening, we also still have Expert Volk. We still have Agito Uprising that feels fairly fresh, and some of the upgrades with the Mana Spiral last month feel pretty enjoyable to use in Master High Midgardstormer's Trial. So there's been not a lot happening, but it's been kind of okay for me, at least. It's been a pretty relaxing period, enough interesting things to do, but not so much that I feel overwhelmed like during the time attack. I think that that's a pretty good place to be, especially with Monster Hunter coming at the end of the month, but I wanted to check in with y'all, see how everything's going, and talk about what's new in terms of the showcase and the Wyrmprints. So to spend a brief moment on Flames of Reflection, right now both of these have free daily summons happening, but it's only a single summon. If you log in every day and do your free daily summon, you're going to be able to summon 9 times on each of these banners. So just to remind y'all, the pity rate doesn't increase until you've summoned 10 times. So even if you do all those free dailies, you'd want to burn 1 additional single to increase your pity rate before you did any tenfolds after that. And I would suggest you wait these out. I don't think that they are game-changing enough that you want to summon right away, especially when you get those free summons and you might have the possibility of getting somebody you really like. That said, it all comes down to personal preference. If you love some of these units and their designs, this is probably going to be your best chance to pick them up. But when it comes to Flames of Reflection and this getting a revival, that might not actually be the case, because you never know when your banner is going to get revived. There could be a future time that you could pick up units. And even for Windswept Harbingers, we're going to see that this has a lot of similarities to the Windswept Warriors banner that we got last year. So to start with Flames of Reflection, this features the characters who are in the event story, so the 3 Sisters of the Anvil, Renea, Ramona, and then at 4-star, Renea, who's Water Element. Renea is definitely the least remarkable of these. I had hoped that she might get a Mana Spiral as of this banner rerun, but it looks like that's not going to be happening, that maybe Ieyasu was a special exception to that. And we also have Emma on focus, and at 4-star, Phoenix, and for the 5-star dragon, Arctos. Where's Arctos? There he is. So this is a really solid banner, but I will say that a lot of these flame characters have fallen out of favor a little bit for Expert Volk. These are some of the most popular characters. They were used in the meta comps that dominated a lot of the clears for Master High Midgardstormer. Even though a lot of these characters, all of the flame characters here, have sleep res rather than stun res. At the time, Renea was one of the only really great sources of high damage burn. That also enabled Burning Punisher on Ramona, which increased her damage. And so they were a very effective combination, and the HP check in that fight was high enough that you wanted both a Ramona and an Emma. And furthermore, you wanted that Emma to be able to cast her defensive buff right at the start of a fight. Now we have options like Halloween Lowen, we have our Flame Tree, we have our Mana Spirals. So there's lots of ways to break open that fight. There's adventurers that dispel the defensive buffs that Midgardstormer casts upon himself, making the fight smoother overall. It's still one of the more challenging Master Trials, I think, but it's been opened up a lot, and these are not necessarily the most prevalent characters as they once were. And for that matter, these are not as popular characters in Expert Volk. I think that Renea certainly is serviceable, but when there's burners like Yuden and Xania that have become very popular, you're going to run out of instances where you can burn the boss very quickly, because the more you burn the boss, the quicker they build up a tolerance to that and a resistance to that. In the case of Volk, There's a plague mechanic which can be used to further burn him despite him building up a resistance, but it is still a limitation. You are still going to be missing on some of those burn procs when he is not plagued. So I do think she's a little weaker in that fight. Ramona, very good in the second phase, but I think people kind of lack confidence to go in with her because it's very easy to get tripped up and trap your group in the first phase of Expert Volk. A common mistake is to overcommit to skills, and Ramona has one of the skills where it's very easy to get punished. Her first skill has a very, very long animation, and during that first phase where Volk is throwing out his shuriken, you can easily end up in a bad spot if you're in the middle of your S1, your first skill for Ramona, your Forge Buster, and I think that's kind of soured people on her. But honestly, in phase 2, she's really incredible. She still has very good DPS, and a lot of the moves that Volk throws out are really easy to iframe with a long iframe. So I think she's actually quite good, underrated. Both very good in Mercurial Gauntlet, which reset today. So if you're trying to push forward in that, they're awesome. Arctos, I think, is a fantastic dragon. Really good dragon form, dragon transformation, especially on characters with that high enough critical rate in order to utilize him well. I'm thinking of characters like Ezilith, Mikoto, who have really good critical rate, and especially on teams with Halloween Mim or a dagger like Ezilith to increase the entire team's critical rate. Arctos is fantastic in terms of the damage when you're transformed, but more importantly, the utility of being able to stun nowadays is actually really good. It used to be that in the hardest content, the bosses were completely immune to the most debilitating status effects. In the standard and expert high dragon trials, that tends to be the case. You're not out there sleeping, stunning these bosses, freezing these bosses. But nowadays, there's at least a chance that you can do that. And for Master High Midgard Stormer, it's relevant. It can let you skip a Gale Blast, and that's very helpful. That's a point in the fight when people tend to mess up because it's pretty challenging to coordinate. And in Expert Volk, it can help you with things like the Blood Moon that he'll do, where if you don't knock down the Blood Moon, destroy the Blood Moon in time, or stun him, it wipes out your team entirely. So Arctos, I think, is a really good slept-on dragon. Not as many characters where he's going to be the best choice as far as DPS. It's really like Halloween Mim, Ezilith, and Mikoto that come to mind, at least as far as who's popular. But still, on those characters, it always feels great to have access to an Arctos on a team. So there are even some others where it's not necessarily optimal DPS, but like Emma or Lowen, if he lacks other options, might run an Arctos just so they can stun and help the team in that way, and avoid or reduce the chance that the team fails the run. So Arctos is pretty awesome. Emma, great buff bot. Problem in Expert Volk is again in that first phase, and to a lesser extent in the second phase, her uptime just not being super great. You're running around a lot in the first phase, dodging. So her main challenge would be getting to the second phase. If you can do that, I think you're perfectly good to clear. I'm sure that she has cleared. I've seen her clear before. But really, your challenge will be, can you transform Volk fast enough? And if your uptime on buffs is not great, or you don't have great DPS running alongside you, that could be an issue in the first phase, but she's still good. Renea, unfortunately, not much to say there. Her team healing double buff is special, it's unique, but it's such a small amount that it's really not noteworthy unless they upgrade it. And Phoenix, if you're a newer player, highly recommend picking up a copy of Phoenix. She can help you with a lot of solo content, raid content for trying to get those deathless runs. As you go on, you kind of don't need her as much, but I will say in things like, say, high-level Mercurial Gauntlet, it's very common to run a Phoenix or a Freya on a buff bot and use them as part of your dragon transformation, not run a healer in your team at all, and have that fulfill the healing that you need for some of the unavoidable damage. So she's still not obsolete by any means. She's still quite good. So this is actually a good banner. It's just that nothing here is limited, and we got basically this same banner in the past. So if you have these units already, it's hard to recommend summoning on this one outside the free summons. And if you don't have them, unless you're lacking in the flame element significantly, I don't know that you necessarily go for this, because you could always build characters with the mana spiral nowadays, like Yuden, who everybody has. So it's hard to recommend this one, even though everything's quite good on it. And Windswept Harbingers is in a similar situation, but I would say even amped up an extra degree as far as the power level. This is probably one of the strongest banners I've seen in a long time. However, it's coming right after this limited showcase that we had for New Year's, right before potentially Gala, potentially Monster Hunter. Well, we know Monster Hunter's happening sometime soon, and Gala probably happening if they keep up their schedule of every 2 months. So unfortunately for this showcase, it's more so that it's really good. It's just positioned at such a time when you need to have a lot of resources to be able to justify dipping into this. I'm planning on going in with just the free summons, see what I get, and then make a determination, because I want to see at least what our preview is of the next banner, what that's going to look like. Do I want to pull on that more than on this? But this showcase is all about the wind element. In my opinion, the water Mercurial Gauntlet past level 50 is actually one of the hardest. You're taking a lot of damage from Roy's Collapse, and it can be hard to win in time, especially without Victor. So Victor is at a rate up on this showcase, easily the best bleed unit in Wind. There's not a lot of competition. It's basically him and Addis. Addis is still very good, but the tempo of those fights, the Mercurial Gauntlet, I find that Victor is a little bit better, easier to maintain, has that knockback elimination on a second seal, which is super helpful, lets you just combo unimpeded. Kirsty, we'll get into her exact kit, but from what I've seen so far, she is a DPS powerhouse, very, very strong, good modifiers, surprisingly strong for a Lance, but we'll get into her kit more specifically. And the aesthetic on these, all the units on right up here, they're all Windswept units, is really cool. There's a cohesion to it that I so wish we had an event around all 4 of these characters, but maybe we'll get that one day. As far as the dragon, Garland is the new dragon. We'll get into details on his kit, but Garland and Kirsty both have a mechanic where they want to avoid getting knocked back. If you can avoid that, they're really awesome. They're fantastic. If you're in a situation where you're going to be knocked back frequently, not as good, but Victor pairs really well with them because Victor's skills, a second skill eliminates knockback. For 4 stars, we have a new 4-star. I'm not sure how to pronounce this name, but I'm going to pronounce it as Joaquim. So let me know if you think it should be pronounced differently, but I'm pretty sure it's not Joaquim. I feel like that's completely wrong, but it looks like Joaquim, like Joaquin. So that's what I'm going to go with. I am very saddened by his existence because he is another Windbow poison unit that competes with Eleonora very favorably, just like Luis did. So I'm sad about him, but for those who are interested in such a unit, pretty strong, surprisingly strong. And Noelle is just the best buff bot pretty much in the game, outside of Galacleo perhaps, but I think for Wind specifically, she is really, really good. And Wind has the tools like Freya, and with her having a wand co-ability that just push her over the top, so that's why I say that she's the best. And for 4-star dragons, there's even a strength-focused dragon in the form of Rock. Rock has a decent skill at clearing out crowds, so there's some utility to Rock, even as a 4-star, but that's it as far as what's featured on the showcase. Everything just looks very solid. However, you have to remember, all these things look solid in the context that Wind has not yet gotten any mana spirals. So are these units going to get spiraled at that point? Are other units, older units, going to get a spiral and then surpass these? That is very possible. We just don't know. We don't even know when or how frequently those things will roll out. We know this month we're getting Shadow. Maybe there will be a smattering of other off-element characters within that, just like in December we got 2 Shadow characters along with the rest of the Flame characters. But it is a mystery as of yet. It could be that the last fight in terms of Agito that comes out is Water Element, and so we're waiting a long time before we get Wind Spiral if they're rolling out along with the fights. We just don't know that yet, so let's focus on what we do know, and that is these characters' kits. So I always like to look at this information, but keep in mind what's missing here. You are going to find out about the character. You're going to find out about their stats at level 80. So not max stats for characters who have access to a spiral. And you're going to see their skills, co-ability, abilities, and so on. But what's missing here are two things. One is the charge time on these skills. How fast are these to unleash? And the second thing is actually the damage modifier. So is this a high damage skill or a low damage skill? That's the type of information that you need to go to a third-party resource to find right now, which basically amounts to the wiki, Gamepedia, or GamePress. I think both of them have that type of detail. I tend to go to the wiki, so thank you to the wiki team volunteers who provide that type of info. And that type of info is also what gets rolled into a lot of the popular resources for Dragalia, like the DPS simulators, like the forks that allow you to compare the DPS of different builds, which are also really helpful tools. Not to be taken at face value. You do want to know what assumptions are going into that. Try to be realistic in how you use that type of data and information. It's not the be-all end-all by any means, but that's usually a pretty good way as a starting point to jump off into thinking about how do I analyze these characters. And I believe those are updated now with these new characters as well. So for Kirsty, very simple set of skills. Her first skill just deals damage, just a basic damage dealing skill. Her second skill provides a team buff to strength for the entire team of 20% for 15 seconds. On paper, it looks very similar to Xainfried. Hopefully Xainfried gets his spiral eventually, but just very simple kit. HP co-ability, which is standard on lances, so no special co-ability for her. But what really sets Kirsty apart and enables her to have excellent DPS is definitely this Dauntless Strength ability. So Dauntless Strength is kind of the new mechanic, the new thing that they are featuring on this banner. In this case, it's Dauntless Strength of 20%, increases strength by 20% for every 15 seconds that pass without the user being knocked back by an enemy. This buff can stack up to 3 times. All stacks will be lost upon being knocked back by an enemy. So you can stack a 60% strength buff on her. Granted, it takes 45 seconds to stack it, and you can't get knocked back in that time, otherwise the whole thing resets. It's like you're building up a house of cards, essentially, and if you get hit, everything collapses. So it's a pretty fun effect, I think. It introduces a new type of gameplay. We've had abilities in the past like Resilient Offense, Barrage Obliteration, which is about successive combos. We've had Flurry, which is about keeping a combo. And now we have Dauntless, which is kind of a defensive ability that you just have to avoid getting knocked back. So if you're completely across the map, not dealing with any enemies, you can just hang out and you'll have your strength buff. Now, granted, you want to use that strength buff, you want to be attacking things, so that's not a great way to utilize this. But I do think it's kind of a new game space, new design space, which is cool that they've pushed into. We've seen the knockback avoidance a couple of times now. Victor is the one that I remember, but I feel like there's another instance. Maybe it's Julieta and it's a personal one, but I'm not sure about that. But as far as Dauntless Strength, obviously Victor is an excellent combination. His second skill, Buff, is not going to be active all the time, but while it is active, and he does have a buff time passive, which should extend that, while it is active, Kirsty should be able to keep Dauntless Strength up. And just furthermore, for the content where she's going to do really well, which is pretty much High Mercury's Trial as far as endgame content, or the Mercurial Gauntlet, at least for High Mercury's Trial, she's not really going to knock you back very much if you're playing carefully. There are moves that can hit you at close range, like her Stomp, her Dash, but Lances are usually not at the front lines of attacks like that. In Master difficulty, her Stomp does send out a tremor or a shockwave in the earth, and that could potentially catch you off guard. But usually, for most team comps that go into that trial, you're not running a healer, you're going to be at low HP anyway, and a mistake like that would probably reset your run to begin with, unless you're pretty far into the run. and say your Wedding Elisan or your Freyas have healed you up. So I actually don't think it's too big of a penalty. In Mercurial Gauntlet, I'm not as sure on this. I'm trying to think, but I do think that for the most part, the claps that happen are every 15 seconds. What I'm wondering to myself is whether those claps execute upon 15 seconds or afterward, but for her, it shouldn't really matter very much just on her own. Whether it's before or after, I mean, you might just have your 20% buff up and then it immediately gets reset, at least for levels 50 plus in the Mercurial Gauntlet. Finally, the last ability that Kirsty has, besides her Bog Res, is Poison Punisher of 30%. Another of these characters, just like Ieyasu, who has no ability to inflict poison themselves, but essentially wants the enemy to be poisoned to deal the maximum damage possible. Lathna is in a similar position, but both Kirsty and Ieyasu are a little bit different in that they don't really need the Punisher to be good. Just if you're able to keep Dauntless Strength up without Poison Punisher, Kirsty is still a pretty good DPS unit. So it seems like the Poison Punisher is a cherry on top. She's definitely better, a lot better if you have Poison Punisher active, but you also have to question, can you really afford that in your team comp? And that's one of the things I felt with this banner, and with Poison in general, is it's still at a point where, at least for Wind, I don't feel like there's a high enough power enabler. For Shadow, you have Delphi, who is very powerful, very solid co-ability. I'm not quite sure that Joaquim gets to that level of power that you need in an enabler to, say, sacrifice a really good team member like a Wedding Elisan or a Noelle just to include them for the poison effect. And especially in a case like Master High Mercury's Trial, where it's very hard to run Poison Punisher Wyrmprints because you kind of need defensive prints. So that's all I really want to say about Kirsty. Seems like a very powerful unit, a lot of good attributes. At the same time, she does require some setup. She's a little situational. That Dauntless Strength is really going to make or break her, so if the content that she's in does not allow you to utilize that, she's going to be worse. As far as Garland, Garland is sort of the complement to Kirsty, and I would say Garland is parallel in a lot of ways to Daiko Kuten. So Garland has a straightforward skill that deals damage. He gives you 50% strength right off the bat, just like Daiko Kuten, and then his second effect potentially allows you to bump up that strength to an 80% total bonus, pending some conditions. So in his case, every time 15 seconds pass and you haven't been knocked back by an enemy during that, you are going to get a shield that blocks damage less than 40% of your maximum HP. It can stack with ordinary shields. It's a divergent shield, so if you have some other shield mechanics on your team, it will be able to stack with that. Shield mechanics are not that common, that stacking is really typically a thing, but it would stack with that. And while that shield is active, you're going to get an additional 30% strength buff. So the cool thing I think about Garland is 80% strength is a lot, number one. For ranged characters, number two, you're not going to be getting knocked back very often, or at least you shouldn't be. You're not on the front lines of the battle trying to bait things typically. Maybe if you make a mistake, you might get knocked back, but it shouldn't happen that much. So I think that that's a pretty good use case. And then I was going to say, for the Mercurial Gauntlet, not the ideal scenario, but if this 40% shield is big enough that you avoid knockback because you completely block the damage from one of Roy's claps, I think that this could actually work, and that by the time the next clap happens, your next shield would be up, you would get your strength buff. It does say you only get 30% strength while the shield is active, so losing the shield to that clap is somewhat costly. You're going to be going down to 50% strength. So it may not be the best setup, but I do think Garland is powerful enough that he's quite a good dragon. If you were, say, debating between do I invest in Zephyr or Garland, Garland is a very worthy consideration. When comparing to Vayu or even Pazuzu, I think it's a little bit harder to evaluate. It's going to depend a lot on your ability to maintain this Dauntless Rampart 2 ability. In some cases, I think that Vayu or Pazuzu might end up being a little better, but if you're able to keep this all the time, then Garland is probably going to be better. And ultimately, it depends on the unit, of course, and the rest of their build. But Garland is solid. It looks like to me, Garland is probably going to be good on Eleonora, but not that much better than Pazuzu that I feel like I need to summon. As tempting as it is to make her the world's ultimate Eleonora, I might have to pass on that. I don't think I could afford to spend that many stones on Garland. And I feel like if you're in the similar situation where you already have Vayu, you already have Zephyr, say, maybe you have Pazuzu, or some of the other dragons even, like Long, unless you really have a hole for a wind dragon, I don't think that Garland does enough right now. If there's a lot harder water content in the future, if we get, water Agito Uprising next, sure, maybe at that point you want to invest because you want to really push the frontier of what your team can do. As of now, though, I don't think that's really necessary. So finally, we get to Joaquim, the 4-star who is new on this banner. I already lamented how he compares pretty favorably to Eleonora, and it looks like to me that he compares favorably to Luis as well, at least based on what I've seen simmed out so far. So with Joaquim, he differentiates himself from both of those units in that he's not purely focused on attacking per se. He has a significant amount of his damage that's due to his team contribution, and especially if you're in a situation where your team has the print slots that they can afford to run the new Plaguebringer print, then he's going to be a very helpful presence, and a necessary presence probably for a win team outside of some other units like Musashi or Silas. So Joaquim's skill, Last Resort, deals wind damage to the target and nearby enemies and inflicts poison. Poison foes take extra damage. Activates skill shift if the attack connects. Phase 2 increases poison success rate, while Phase 3 increases the entire team's strength by 15% for 10 seconds. So Phase 3 is actually a pretty short buff. In Phase 2, from what I've seen on the wiki, it looks like it's 160% proc chance for poison. So remember, that's going to subtract whatever the enemy's resistance is from that. So say the enemy has built up already 90% resistance, well, with 160% proc chance, you still have a 70% chance of poisoning them. So that's quite good. It means that you can maintain poison even as enemies build up tolerance. However, the bad thing about Joaquim's first skill, Last Resort, is that the damage modifier is very, very low. So I believe it's 440%, which is low. It's higher if the enemy is poisoned, of course, and it's not going to be too hard for him to cycle through it because it has a very fast charge time. And Joaquim's second skill, Operation Zero, immediately readies Last Resort for use and increases his strength by 25% for 5 seconds. So this is very similar to what we saw on Floor, but I feel like Joaquim as a bow is kind of like a cross between Floor and Norwin. Inherently, as a bow and with the lower modifiers, he's not quite in the ballpark of Floor. Floor has been pretty absurd and definitely surpassed my expectations as far as her contributions in the meta and her DPS. Joaquim is not on that level by any means, but in a dedicated poison team, as your poison enabler, if you're running with Kirsty, maybe you're running with Victor for the bleed, and he's able to afford a poison punisher Wyrmprint, at that point having Joaquim on your team is going to be very valuable. He has the skill haste co-ability just like all bows. HP 70% equals strength 10%, which is pretty much always going to be relevant. In Master High Mercury or in Expert, if you're not running a healer, it may take you a while to get up to that point, but if you're able to fit a Wedding Alisand in your comp, or say a Noelle with a Freya, there will at least be part of the match where that should be active. He has Bog Res of 100% and then Poison Punisher of 20%. And as far as building Joaquim, I believe that you would probably want to use... I think you would probably want to use Garland because the skill damage is not great. But I could also see it working out that you use Vayu with the Poison Punisher Wyrmprint and Dear Diary. Bows are kind of in an awkward spot because both of the prints that they can have access to are quite good and work well together. So for respawns, you get a lot of skill damage, max that out, and Dear Diary, you kind of max out your critical rate. It can be hard to fit in that Poison Punisher print, but when you're running a skill damage dragon, it tends to be a little better to bring in Poison Punisher than, say, run for respawns. So that's pretty much it as far as the banner. I've already alluded to it several times, but let me just go to the Wyrmprint so you can see what's new. There is a new Wyrmprint that focuses on buff time that is excellent for pretty much all wind buffers. That's going to include Noelle. It's also going to include Dragalia Zanefried and even Melody, who hasn't surfaced as much recently. But this Dog's Day Wyrmprint, great artwork, very good effect, highest buff time that we really see on any print. It is locked to an element, but on a single print, 25% is still the highest that we've seen on any one print. And then the Wind Skill Haste may or may not be relevant. I'm not sure Noelle's exact cutoffs. If you're running a Max Unbound Freya, you have a bow on a team, I don't know that this necessarily gets you to your skills any faster. If it does, that's great, but even without that, having the higher amount of buff time, this is already probably going to be one of your better options. So I think it's a great print. The Plaguebringer, the new 4-star print, is what I've been talking about with Poison Punisher. Not much more I want to say. It's kind of in an awkward spot where it is good on certain units. It's cool that it can be used for both Wind and Shadow, but a lot of the previous units that focus on Poison, like Eleonora, Luis, I don't know that they necessarily want to run this so much as they want their teammates to have access to it. But interestingly, you'll see that they gave Poison that same 25% cap as they did to Paralysis. So Burn is capped at 30% for Punisher, but for Poison and Paralysis, I guess they nerfed it. One of the reasons that may be the case is the context of Burn. Burn, you can only burn Midgard Stormer a certain amount of times, like 9 times. Or is it 11? It's something like that. As opposed to for High Mercury and High Jupiter, you can poison them a lot more times. You can poison them 20 times. So maybe that's why they decided to nerf the Punisher effects on these. I'm not really sure. But it is what it is. This print only provides Punisher, so maybe if we get another print one day, like Spirit of the Season, that gives you full HP equals strength, or some other good effect at a 5-star rarity, that would be even better, even more lucrative. But even as things are, this is going to open the door for people who haven't been able to clear Mercurial Gauntlet, maybe are struggling at lower levels of difficulty because they didn't have access to the Elegant Escort Burning Punisher Wyrmprint, and now they can build team comps and setups around Poison Punisher instead. And where I'm most excited about this is actually for the Monster Hunter collab, because we know we're going to have neutral element content. So I can already imagine a boss fight where I'm using Eleonora to, say, power up my Ieyasu because he can deal extra damage to poison foes. Or maybe even I bring in my Lathna. So I think that that's going to be a really cool setting to utilize this in. I'm pretty sure already some of the new Mana Spiral Shadow units that we have so far have been effective even on Master High Jupiter's Trial. So that fight is slowly opening up beyond Call it Cleo, but I think the clears are still slower and less consistent, so it's not really at a point where they're super popular strategies, but at least if you don't have her, there are avenues to get into that fight now. I've been going on for quite a while at this point, so thank you so much for watching. This was a pretty fun discussion, got into a lot of depth on everything as far as the Windswept Harbinger showcase, and then a little bit of Flames of Reflection as well. I really like just talking about the meta sometimes, talking about what units are like, how they perform, my opinion of them. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I would love to hear your opinions as well. This hopefully will serve as guidance on whether or not you should summon on this showcase. For me, as I said, it's got to be a wait and see, because Monster Hunter, Gala, all of those things could potentially be awesome. So once again, that's going to do it for today. Thank you as always for watching, everyone. Take care, and I'll see you next time.